The UN Charter distinctly states that staff members of the UN are prohibited to maintain any...
They're supposed to be impartial.
Completely impartial and unbiased.
And that's the exact opposite of what we've seen.
What's happened with UNRWA and with UNRWA staff members is distinctly in violation of the UN Charter and the staff rules of the UN. I was involved in drafting part of those staff rules of the UN, and they echo what's written in the UN Charter.
You're listening to another episode of East to West. Today we're going to talk about UNRWA and how a UN agency that was created initially to support the relief and human development of Palestinian refugees has become a Hamas front in Gaza. Since the October 7th massacre, at least 9 UNRWA employees were revealed to be involved in the atrocities committed that day. Additionally, Israel found Hamas members employed as principals and teachers in UNRWA schools, Hamas infrastructure and weapons in the basements of these schools, and Hamas data centers in tunnels underneath the agency's headquarters in Gaza. Since then, 3 of the newly released Israeli hostages have reported that they were held at one of the agency's refugee camps for part of their captivity. Now, Israel has since then banned the UN aid agency. U.S. President Donald Trump has frozen all U.S. foreign assistance to the agency. But is it not time for other democracies to stop using taxpayer money to fund an organization that is colluding with terror? My guest today is Ambassador Alan Baker. He's the director of the Institute for Contemporary Affairs at the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs. He's also the head of the Global Law Forum. He participated in the negotiations and the drafting of the Oslo Accords with the Palestinians, as well as agreements and peace treaties with Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. He served as legal advisor and deputy director general of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and as Israel's ambassador to Canada. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining me today. Now, UNRWA was established over 75 years ago when the United Nations recommended the establishment of 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab, side by side. The Jews accepted, formed the State of Israel. The Arabs didn't, and that resulted in the 1948 war. Now, UNRWA is mandated to provide educational and health services to Palestinian refugees, but it doesn't seek to resolve that these refugee cases, instead perpetuating them. Tell me about that.
Well, first of all, its original mandate wasn't to provide health and educational services. It was to provide relief, rehabilitation, and to prevent starvation and distress. And it was set up as an interim measure for 1 year, with the hope, and it stresses specifically in the resolution, which is as old as I am, that the aim being to provide this relief as soon as possible, so that the residents of the area can move into a mode of living normally and reconstruction, rather than being refugees.
And form eventually a Palestinian state side by side to the Israeli state.
Well, it doesn't say that.
But in theory, that was the concept, right? Was to find a temporary solution to help these refugees and give them, as you say, support.
The aim was to provide and specify to advance stabilization and the hope of achieving peace. It doesn't say between who and who, in what form, in what state. But the aim was a temporary measure. Now, there's nothing more permanent in the United Nations than what is temporary, but that was the aim. And it said, well, we'll do it for a year, and then next year we will review it. The following year, they said, well, this was in 1950, we haven't succeeded in making much progress, and so let's extend. And this is what happened every year, and every year not only was the mandate extended, but the mandate was enlarged to cover more and more fields. And the more that UNRWA became, rather than a temporary or interim measure, a permanent organization, so then it became an organization which was no longer dealing with aiming at ending refugeeism, but at prolonging refugeeism, because the local population became dependent on UNRWA.
It could also be said that they relied so heavily on it because that Palestinian state was never formed, as you have been very much a part of all those attempts to create peace and a two-state solution, which unfortunately never happened.
Well, the idea of a Palestinian state was never really discussed then. The 1947 partition resolution of the UN, which came before UNRWA, said that the aim is to provide two states for the two peoples, for the Israelis and the Arabs. So it didn't say Palestinian state. The Arab states, the Arab League, rejected this. The Israelis accepted it and agreed to it, but the Arab states declared that they object to it. It never entered into force, and they immediately invaded the nascent state of Israel. So the issue of whether there was any intention to create a Palestinian state or not was never really discussed. It's always been a possibility had things turned out other than they did turn out. Had there been a responsible leadership among the Arab states and among what ultimately became the Palestinians to negotiate and finalize an agreement, then I myself participated in these negotiations with Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas and all their colleagues, and there was genuine feeling that we might be progressing towards coming to some type of arrangement between us that would enable bon voisinage between two peoples.
Do you feel now, in retrospect, looking back, do you feel like that peace was really achievable when we know what we know now, what we've seen about the radicalization of Gazans in the Gaza Strip today?
It might have been achievable then. Since then, because of this radicalization over the last 20 years, if I were to come today and take the drafts of the Oslo Accords and ask myself whether these would be acceptable today, I'd come to the conclusion that they wouldn't be. Things have changed, time has gone by, they've become so radicalized that any idea of accepting the presence of the state of Israel here in this area is no longer possible.
When we're talking about that radicalization in the Gaza Strip, this isn't a case of a few bad apples, and I want to talk about specifically that complicity between UNRWA and Hamas. Can you give us a little bit more details about that?
Look, it's a historical process because, as I explained, UNRWA became a permanent institution and its mandate was renewed every year. The process of voting in favor of renewing the mandate became a political process which was advanced by the Arab countries. So part of the politicization of the UN over those years seeped into the politicization of UNRWA. And so ultimately UNRWA became an organization that adopted basically, that was directed by an orientation that was basically hostile to Israel. And this increased year after year. And then in 2007, Hamas took over the Gaza Strip by force. They threw the Fatah organization out. They basically violated the Oslo Accords, frustrated the Oslo Accords.
This was after the Israeli pullout in 2005.
Yes. Once they took over, and they violently took over, and they throwing Fatah officials off the roofs of houses and things like that. They controlled the Gaza Strip, and so therefore they controlled the education and they controlled the medical establishments, and they controlled the bodies that were dealing with relief and aid to refugees, UNRWA. And so what actually happened was that UNRWA fell under the authority and control of Hamas.
It employed people. I mean, many of these teachers were either
Absolutely.
Hamas members,
Yes.
encouraged anti-Semitism, praised and even celebrated the October 7th massacre. And these are all people that were on UN
Yes.
payroll. Now, talk to me about how, following the Hamas essential takeover of these UNRWA agencies within the Gaza Strip, how they were able to essentially indoctrinate Palestinian children through the UNRWA curriculum. I'm talking about textbooks featuring not just anti-Israel sentiment, but anti-Semitic documents.
Because this was part of the syllabus that had been set by the educational authorities governed by Hamas. But it had also been there previously during the general Palestinian administration. In other words, UNRWA for many, many years has never been an organization that has advanced a syllabus of pure education for equality and one thing and another. It always had an orientation which fitted itself to the orientation of the local Arab region. And this was an orientation that was predominantly anti-Israel and anti-Semitic.
It's impossible to criticize UNRWA without putting the blame also on the UN, which is the parent body, the UN, that was so complacent in UNRWA becoming essentially a death cult sponsored by the United Nations, paid for by international taxpayers. Why has the UN been so complacent despite Israel's repeated evidence of UNRWA being complicit in terrorism?
Because the UN is a political organization. The majority of states that determine the policy of the UN and that pay the budget of the UN are those states who adopt the resolutions. And these are the resolutions that are mostly resolutions directed against Israel or critical of Israel or condemning Israel. And so, I wouldn't just blame the UN. I'd blame the states that pay the UN budget, including some of Israel's best friends, the Europeans, the Americans, the Canadians, the Australians, in addition to, of course, the Arab countries. But it's very convenient to go, we'll go along with whatever the UN determines. And then they're divesting themselves of a large percentage of responsibility and authority, and the UN is responsible. But the UN, nobody denies the fact that the UN is a political organization. The UN hasn't been able to solve any of these issues of the Middle East because of the political reasons. People were surprised at the statement by the UN Secretary General basically blaming Israel for everything that happened on the 7th of October. I was shocked. I wasn't surprised because that was a UN position that he was representing. He gets his salary from the United Nations.
UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese, denied the anti-Semitic character of the October 7th massacre. She claimed it was an act of resistance. Another UN employee paid for by taxpayers. How does the UN end up with so many vile people on its staff?
Because they're attracted by the orientation of the UN in that direction. And so it's only natural for them to find a very convenient home base in order to be able to carry out their professional functions in fitting with their personal views. She's not just anti-Israel. She's openly anti-Semitic. It's like those anti-Semites who say some of my best friends are Jews. So this is more or less what she's saying. But this is the UN position, and anybody who expects anything else from the UN then isn't really familiar with the organization. I worked in the UN for 4 years as a UN staff member, and I'm very intimately connected with the organization. I'm sad because potentially, the dreams of the founding fathers of the United Nations were for a universal organization which would be totally impartial and unbiased. And the UN Charter distinctly states that members, officials of the UN, staff members of the UN are prohibited to maintain any...
they're supposed to be impartial.
Completely impartial and unbiased.
And that's the exact opposite of what we see.
What's happened with UNRWA and with the UNRWA staff members is distinctly in violation of the UN Charter and the staff rules of the UN. I was involved in drafting part of those staff rules of the UN, and they echo what's written in the UN Charter.
Given your time at the United Nations, what were some of the most surprising things that you learned while working there, specifically when it came to the bias when it comes to Israel?
Well, because I was one of the only Israeli staff members there, and by the way, the UN staff is divided up in between representatives of member states according to the size of the budget that a member state pays. For instance, the United States pays 25% of the UN budget, so it has 25% of the UN employees. The Russians have 11%, the Japanese have 8%, I think, and Israel has about a 0.7% or something like that. So in short, there were about 8 Israeli UN staff members, and I was one of them. And so they made sure to keep me away from the political activities, and because I'm a lawyer, so they put me into the legal office in the Secretary General's office dealing with delicate legal issues, but I wasn't really allowed to get involved in the political stuff.
Because you were Israeli?
Yes.
President Trump has now signed an executive order freezing all U.S. foreign assistance funding for 90 days, including UNRWA, and the agency has also been cut during the first Trump administration. Now, his new ambassador to the UN, Elise Stefanik, has stated that we should never tolerate any U.S. taxpayer funds going towards terrorism. And she said that there's other UN organizations that could fill that void that don't have terrorist ties. In your eyes, which UN organization could fill that void?
Well, look, there are several organizations dealing with food assistance and agricultural assistance and assistance to children and various other humane missions. These are all possible candidates for replacing UNRWA. There's also the UN organization that deals with refugees, that UN High Commissioner for Refugees, that functions in accordance with the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees. Why the Palestinian refugees were not part of that organization is very strange. It's presumably because of the political orientation when the 1951 resolution, which was very close after the establishment of UNRWA in 1949, because of that. So they maintained a separation. So
you're saying that political bias towards Israel goes as far back then?
Yes. Yes. But I think, and another thing is this, according to the definition of refugeeism, according to the UNRWA's definition, every refugee, their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, great-nephews, great-nieces, uncles and aunts are refugees. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee definition, refugeeism is only the initial refugees and their immediate offspring. So the most logical solution would be to take any of those Palestinian refugees, if there still remain Palestinian refugees so defined, and they would be absorbed into the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and all the others would be part of the population, the Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip, who would be helped and assisted by whatever relief agency would be established, an independent relief agency, completely not connected to the United Nations, set up in order to deal with rehabilitation and provide relief, but not to deal with education and medicine and things like that, which would be dealt with by whatever governmental or administrative authority would be governing Gaza. In that way, UNRWA would become completely unnecessary. The organization could be dismantled, as suggested by the United States as well, but there would be absolutely no need for it. And the issues dealt with would be dealt with by competent organizations, professional organizations, and not political organizations. And this is the point.
You mentioned obviously that, and we know that as a fact, UNRWA has become a political organization just like the UN. But let's assume for a minute that we were to replace UNRWA with the UNHCR, as you suggested, and we transferred the UNHCR to the Gaza Strip. How do we prevent Hamas from taking over that agency the same way that it has with UNRWA?
Because the hope would be that Hamas wouldn't be able to control whatever administrative machinery will be set up to govern, to administer, to deal with education, to deal with medicine, etc. Of course, this is all depends on the extent to which Israel and the United States and the other countries succeed in removing the power and the influence of Hamas. But in any event, by removing the UN from this equation, so then we'd be preventing the politicization which exists within the UN from entering into the administration of Gaza, which I think is very important.
One last thing. I believe it's every year there's at the UN Security Council, there's a resolution against Iran, there's a resolution against Sudan, I believe, and about 15 resolutions against Israel. In your eyes, how do you fix that blatant, disproportionate anti-Israel bias at the UN? Can it be fixed? Can it be resolved? Can that political direction ever be recentered, or is this just a lost cause?
Look, the UN is the picture of the states composing the UN. And as long as the states are divided up into regional bodies that are headed by a majority of states, Muslim states, non-democratic states, who basically pull the UN in the direction that they want to pull it, the UN will never be able to return back to what it should have been when it was initially established in 1945. So it won't happen. The only other way of dealing with it, and I doubt whether it could ever happen, not in our lifetime, would be to dismantle the UN and establish a new organization of like-minded states, or with criteria for democracy, for good governance, ensuring non-politicization, so that the basic aims and purposes of the UN, which are written in the UN Charter in Articles 1 and 2, which are very clear and very noble, they could then be realized. I doubt whether we could achieve this now. It's too late. Too much time has gone by to enable this to happen.
Ambassador Alan Baker, thank you very much for giving us a explainer today on the unfortunate complacency of the United Nations and its relief agency UNRWA in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.